It was during my third round of chemotherapy when I noticed something strange. I had just come home from the clinic, throat raw from nausea, scalp tender where the last strands of my hair had started falling out. I remember sitting by the kitchen window with a cold cloth on my neck, trying to distract myself by opening the mail. There was a statement from the bank. I hadn't asked for it, but it came anyway. Printed, folded, impersonal. At first, I didn't read the numbers. My eyes skimmed out of habit. But then I saw it. A new name on the joint account. Celeste R. Maddox. Not a relative. Not a lawyer. Not me. I stared at that name like it was something printed in a foreign language. A woman's name. Typed right next to mine. Next to his. It took me a full minute to realize what it meant. My husband had added another woman's name to the account that held my inheritance. The same savings my father left me in trust before he passed. While I was fighting for my life in a recliner with an IV drip in my arm. He was transferring my money. Quietly. Strategically. To someone else. A mistress. I folded the paper carefully. Too carefully. As if it might burn me if I moved too fast. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I sat there, listening to the birds outside my window, the hum of the refrigerator, the echo of my own shallow breath. Then I pulled out the old wooden box under the couch. Inside it were our old marriage documents, financial paperwork, insurance files. I flipped through them like I was digging for air. And there it was. A printed change of beneficiary form. Dated 6 weeks ago. Right after my second hospital admission. He hadn't just added her to the checking account. He'd signed over everything. My savings. My pension. My will. It was all being funneled into new hands. Hands I didn't know. Hands that had never picked me up from radiation, never held my hair back over a toilet, never wiped my tears at 3 in the morning. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet cold against the tile. The master bedroom door was half closed. He was asleep, mouth open slightly, one arm stretched over the place where I used to sleep before I moved to the guest bed after my diagnosis. I stood there, watching him. The man I married at 25. The man I buried 2 babies with. The man who whispered promises into my ear while I carried his name through decades of love, grief, and routine. Now he lay there snoring. While another woman, Celeste, had her name printed next to mine. And suddenly, I realized something I hadn't wanted to believe until that moment. I was sleeping beside a stranger. And the worst part? He was waiting for me to die, so he could give her everything. But what neither of them knew, was that I still had one thing left they couldn't steal. And I was about to use it. If this story already has you holding your breath, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more true emotional stories like this one. My name is Marlene Trask. I'm 73 years old. I've lived in Palm Coast, Florida for most of my adult life. My house is a pale yellow bungalow, quiet, 2 blocks from the water. It used to be filled with family. These days, it's just me, the scent of eucalyptus oil, and the sound of the waves that never stop crashing, even when your world does. I met my husband, Raymond, in 1974 at a Baptist church social. He was charming. Shy smile, pressed shirt, the kind of man who called my daddy sir, and meant it. We were married by winter. For most of our life together, he never raised his voice. Never stayed out too late. He wasn't the passionate type, but I took comfort in that. He mowed the lawn on Saturdays, paid the light bill, rubbed my back when the arthritis got bad. I thought that was love. I thought he was safe. So when I first saw Celeste's name on the account, I didn't want to believe what it meant. I thought maybe she was a lawyer, or a nurse. Some fluke of paperwork. I needed proof. So that evening, while he was watching television and laughing at a rerun of MAS*H, I picked up his phone from the arm of the couch while he was in the bathroom. The passcode was still my birthday. That somehow hurt more than if he'd changed it. I opened the Messages app. Celeste R. There she was. The last message read, "She's sleeping again. Won't be much longer now." The one before that, "You'll get the house, don't worry. I already talked to the notary." I read every message, quietly, holding the phone like it might bite me. They weren't in love. Not in the romantic way, at least. They were plotting, planning, waiting. He was preparing her to take over my life like it was a business he was closing down. The next morning, I told him I needed to borrow his phone to call the pharmacy, just to see if he would hesitate. He handed it over with a smile. I took a breath. "Who's Celeste?" I asked, looking him straight in the eyes. He blinked, then smiled again, slower this time. "She's a financial advisor," he said. "She's helping us move things around in case." He didn't finish the sentence. "In case I die?" I asked, my voice razor sharp. He looked down at his coffee. "Marlene," he said gently, "I just want things to be easy when it's time." I stared at him. "And it didn't occur to you to ask me?" Silence. That's when I knew the answer. It had occurred to him. He just didn't care. I didn't leave that day. Not because I couldn't, but because I needed more time, more information, more leverage. I started looking through the paperwork again, made copies of the bank statements, contacted a lawyer, a quiet man named Ellis I used to volunteer with at the library. He said he'd help me discreetly. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Celeste. She answered on the second ring. "Hello." She sounded young. Younger than I expected. Early 50s, maybe. Soft-voiced. Confident. "Hi, Celeste," I said. "This is Marlene, Raymond's wife." Silence. Then a long, slow breath. "Well," she said, "I was wondering when you'd call." She didn't sound surprised. She didn't sound guilty. She sounded ready. "I know everything," I told her. "No," she said calmly. "You don't." And then she hung up. My hand shook as I placed the phone back on the table. What didn't I know? I had expected deflection, not confirmation. And the way she said it, calm, collected, it chilled me more than if she'd yelled. The next day, I followed Raymond when he said he was going to the grocery store. He didn't go to Publix. He drove 40 minutes down A1A to a condo complex near Daytona. I parked 2 spaces behind him and waited. He didn't knock on any door. He used a key. His own key. He stayed inside for over 2 hours. When he finally came out, he was holding a potted plant and a bag of groceries. And Celeste was at the door, wearing slippers, blowing him a kiss. I started the car. My hands were steady now, because finally, I understood. He hadn't just transferred my inheritance. He had moved into a second life. And while I fought for mine in a cancer ward, he was playing house with a woman who smiled at my suffering like it was a countdown. What they didn't know was that I had something they hadn't accounted for. I was still alive. And I still had the one thing they never imagined I'd use. My mind. The next day, I went to a hardware store I hadn't been to in years. Told the young man at the counter that I needed a nanny cam, but something small, easy to hide. He showed me a clock with a tiny lens in the corner. I bought 2. Paid in cash. Told him they were for my niece's twins. I came home and placed the first one in the living room bookshelf. The second, I tucked between the folded towels in the hallway linen closet, aimed toward the bedroom doorway. If they were going to play games in my home, they'd do it in front of an audience. I'd spent 48 years being the quiet wife, the good wife. But the woman I was now wasn't interested in being soft. I was interested in being smart. Raymond didn't notice the devices. He moved around the house like a man who thought the clock was still ticking in his favor. He hummed as he stirred his coffee, kept the TV on too loud, whispered on phone calls in the hallway, never knowing I could listen again later. That night, I replayed the footage on my laptop. And there she was. Celeste. In my house. She came in through the side door just after 2 p.m. Raymond let her in. They didn't even look guilty. She kissed him on the cheek. Put her purse on my armchair. Sat on the couch like it was hers. I took care of the documents, she said. The transfer will be complete by next week. Good, Raymond said. She's too tired to notice anything these days. They both laughed. I leaned back in my chair, watching the screen like it was someone else's life. Like I was watching a movie I didn't audition for. Then Raymond said something I will never forget. She'll be gone by Christmas. The doctors said it themselves. Celeste nodded. Then we list the house in January. That was when my hand began to shake. Not from chemo. From rage. I closed the laptop. Carefully. Quietly. Walked to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. No hair. Sunken cheeks. Eyes like storm clouds. But behind all that, fire. I wasn't going anywhere. Not without a fight. The next morning, I visited Ellis, the lawyer I had reached out to. I brought the footage. The bank statements. The list of changes Raymond had made to my accounts. My will, my power of attorney. He watched everything without speaking. When the last video clip ended, he looked at me and said, "You have enough to reverse everything." I exhaled. "But Marlene," he added, leaning in, "this won't stay quiet. If we pursue legal action, it'll be in public records. People will know. Friends. Neighbors. I don't care," I said. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not yet. I want to do something else first." He tilted his head. "What's that?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. I want to let him know I know. But I want to do it in my own way. 3 days later, I made dinner. I haven't cooked in a long time, but I laid out a full spread. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the works. Raymond looked surprised when he walked in. "You feeling better?" he asked. "Much," I said. He kissed my cheek like nothing had ever happened. We sat at the table. Ate in silence. Then, as I was clearing the dishes, I looked over my shoulder and said, "How's Celeste?" He froze mid-chew. "Excuse me," I said. I repeated, "How's Celeste?" He put his fork down. Hard. "What are you talking about?" I placed a small remote control on the table. Pressed play. His voice filled the room. The recording played from the hidden speaker inside the bookshelf. "She'll be gone by Christmas." He stood up, eyes wide. "Marlene." I turned the sound off. "You came into my house with her," I said quietly. "You put her on my accounts. You planned my funeral before I was even cold." He stammered. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I said. He looked toward the front door, as if considering escape. "But you're not going anywhere," I said calmly. "Not yet." "Why not?" I leaned in. "Because if you leave now, you won't know what I've done. And trust me, I've done something." His face paled. "Done what?" I didn't answer. I just took a sip of tea and said, "Sleep well, Raymond. While you still can." He didn't touch his food after that. Didn't speak a word for the rest of the night. The next morning, he left for work without saying goodbye. But when I checked the cameras later that day, he didn't go to work. He went straight to Celeste. And they started whispering plans again. That's when I made a plan of my own. Not just to take back my money, but to show both of them exactly what it feels like to be watched. I wasn't a woman who had ever kept secrets. For most of my life, I was the one people trusted with theirs. I was the listener, the keeper, the strong one they came to when they needed calm in the storm. But now, I was the storm. I spent the next 2 weeks tracking everything. I put a second camera in the garage and one inside my jewelry box. An old ring box I knew he'd peek into once I started wearing my mother's emerald ring again. He had been eyeing that ring for years. I also bought a voice recorder and placed it inside the book I always left open by my bedside. It looked like I was still too tired to read, but I listened to every conversation that passed my door. And Celeste. She kept showing up. She stopped pretending to be helpful. Stopped pretending to be concerned. Now she walked around my home in sandals. Used my kitchen towels. Poured herself coffee like she lived there. She even asked Raymond once, "Do we have any of that cinnamon creamer left?" We. The day she said that word, I marked it down in a notebook. Because every "we" was a nail in their coffin. One day, while Raymond was at work, I followed Celeste. She drove a maroon Buick. She parked it at a real estate office near the marina. I waited across the street, sipping a warm drink in my car and pretending to look at a crossword puzzle. She came out 45 minutes later holding a stack of property brochures. She was house hunting. Using my money. She didn't even have the decency to wait until I was gone. I followed her to a quiet street lined with pastel-colored houses. She pulled into the driveway of a small peach-colored home with white shutters. She walked around the property with an agent. Took pictures. Smiled. Laughed. It made my stomach turn. That night, I asked Raymond to rub my shoulders. I pretended to be too weak to lift the laundry basket. I let him feel like the caretaker again. Let him believe I still didn't know what was happening. But I noticed the file folder tucked beneath his nightstand. So when he showered the next morning, I pulled it out. Inside were loan documents, deeds, power of attorney forms with my forged signature. Celeste's name was listed as co-signer on a mortgage application. They were already preparing to buy the house together. My hand didn't tremble anymore. I just put everything back exactly where I found it. The next day, I called Ellis, the lawyer. "I want to move forward," I told him. He was cautious. "With what?" "All of it," I said. "We revoke the power of attorney. We freeze the joint accounts. We file an emergency injunction on the trust. I want everything in writing before he knows what's happened." "And the house?" Ellis asked. "I want him out of it." There was a pause on the other end. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." 2 days later, Ellis and I met with a judge. We presented the medical records, the footage, the financial documents, the falsified signatures. The judge granted everything. Temporary protection of my assets. Emergency nullification of all unauthorized transfers. And an order requiring Raymond to vacate the home within 72 hours. I didn't tell him that night. I made dinner. Quiet. Calm. Same way I always did. He asked if I wanted to go to Celeste's for Thanksgiving so I wouldn't be alone. That was the first time I laughed in his face. "No," I said. "I think I'll stay right here." He looked confused. I just smiled. Because I knew something he didn't. Tomorrow morning, a process server would be knocking on our door. And he'd be served. Right in front of Celeste. The next morning, I made sure I looked as tired and helpless as ever. No makeup. Scarf wrapped around my head. Cup of tea in my hand. I sat by the window when the white car pulled into the driveway. Raymond stood in the kitchen, pouring cereal. The knock came. 3 sharp taps. "Who's that?" he asked. "Why don't you go see?" I said. He opened the door. The man handed him a packet. "Mr. Raymond Trask?" "Yes." "You've been served." The man turned and walked off without another word. Raymond stood frozen, flipping through the papers. "What is this?" he said, turning to me. I took a sip of tea. "You tell me, Ray. You're the financial genius, aren't you?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then came the knock on the back door. Celeste. She walked in, all lipstick and perfume, holding a small purse and wearing a smug smile. Raymond turned to her, wild-eyed. It's from the court. Marlene's she's freezing the accounts. Celeste's smile slipped. I stood up. Don't worry, Celeste. You'll still have the cinnamon creamer, but it'll have to come from your paycheck now. She blinked. I handed her the papers Ellis had given me, a copy of the court injunction. She read the first line and went pale. You're bluffing, she said. No, I said. You are. And then I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the two of them speechless in a house they thought they could steal. Because I wasn't dying. I was just getting started. Raymond didn't speak to me for 2 full days. Not a word. He paced the house like a ghost in loafers. Opened drawers like something had been stolen. Slammed cabinets that never did anything to him. Celeste called non-stop. Her voice echoed through his phone like a siren. I could hear her from the other room. What do you mean she froze everything? What do you mean we're locked out? He didn't have answers. And I didn't offer any. I made my tea. Took my medicine. Read my book by the window like nothing had changed. But everything had. Because now, I was the one in control. On the third morning, a white pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Raymond came into the kitchen where I was folding towels. I'm going to be staying elsewhere for a while, he said, voice flat. All right, I replied, not looking up. If you need anything. I don't. He swallowed. Then left the room without another word. I stood still, hands gripping the towel like a lifeline. Then I walked to the front door and watched as he loaded 3 suitcases and a stack of envelopes into the truck bed. Celeste sat in the passenger seat, sunglasses too big for her face. She didn't wave. I didn't either. They backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. I shut the door and cried. Not because I missed him, but because the silence left behind was the most honest sound I'd heard in years. Ellis called later that afternoon. The emergency orders are solid, but we should move forward with a full revocation of the trust and financial power of attorney. I want everything reversed, I said. All of it. And the will? He asked. He added her as beneficiary on your life insurance policy. I closed my eyes. No. Leave that part. Ellis paused. Are you sure? Yes, I said. Let her keep thinking she's in the will. He didn't ask why. Smart man. That weekend, I cleaned the house top to bottom. Not because it was dirty, but because I needed it to feel mine again. I opened windows. Washed all the linens. Donated the sweaters he never wore but always insisted on keeping. I even repainted the guest bedroom a soft shade of yellow. It was the room I'd retreated to after chemo, when I was too weak to lie next to someone who had already begun mourning me. Now, it felt like a beginning. One night, I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out into the backyard. The wind was soft. The moon hung low. That's when I saw the mailbox flag was up. I hadn't checked the mail in 2 days. I walked barefoot out to the box and opened it. Inside was a thick envelope. Handwritten. No return address. I opened it slowly on the porch. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Celeste and Raymond. At restaurants. On a boat. At a hotel spa. Holding hands in a hospital parking lot I recognized from my last round of chemo. Each photo was stamped with a date and time. The last photo. Celeste going through my nightstand drawer. The same drawer that held my father's will. I felt cold, even though the Florida air was still. There was no note. No signature. Just one final photo tucked behind the rest. Celeste at a notary office. Signing a document that looked like a property transfer. Wearing my necklace. The one I hadn't seen in over a month. I called Ellis the next morning and told him to prepare a restraining order. He asked if I was sure. I'm past sure, I said. I'm ready. That afternoon, the sheriff knocked on her condo door. She answered barefoot, still smug, still sure of herself. until she read the words on the paper. Restraining order. Fraud investigation. Forged beneficiary claim. Unauthorized property transfer. Theft. By the time she looked up, she knew. This wasn't going away. Raymond tried to call me that night. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. I didn't know she'd go that far. I didn't, Marlene. I thought we were just getting through it. He paused. I didn't think you'd survive. That's the one sentence I replayed over and over. I didn't think you'd survive. Not hope. Not pray. Think. He had already buried me. Planned for it. Built a new life on top of what he thought would be my grave. But I wasn't buried. I was blooming. And I still had one move left. 2 weeks passed. The house was mine again. No footsteps in the hallway. No phone calls whispered behind closed doors. No strange perfume lingering on the couch. I started leaving the windows open, letting the air breathe again. My hair was beginning to grow back, just barely. Soft fuzz like the first grass after a fire. One morning, I went in for a checkup. My oncologist said the results were promising. He smiled for the first time in months. "You've got fight in you," he said. "I've got more than that," I replied. On the way out of the hospital, I stopped by the financial services office. I wanted to double-check my insurance documents. Make sure Celeste's name was nowhere it didn't belong. As I waited in the small lobby, flipping through a health pamphlet, I heard it. Her voice. "I'm here about my beneficiary status on a life policy. Marlene Trask." I turned my head slowly. She stood 5 feet from me, wearing a blue blouse, glossy hair pinned up, sunglasses on her head like a crown. She hadn't seen me yet. The receptionist looked at her paperwork. "We'll need proper documentation. ID, proof of power of attorney, and signed consent from the policyholder." Celeste smiled. "I have all of that." That's when I stood up. She turned and saw me. Her entire face drained. "Marlene," she stammered. "Hello, Celeste," I said. "Running errands." I thought you were at treatment today," she muttered. "Funny," I said. "I thought you'd be in jail by now." The receptionist looked confused. Celeste glanced at the door, suddenly unsure. "I'd like to file a fraud report," I said calmly to the receptionist. "She's here under false pretense. She's been removed from all documents, and I have a court injunction." Celeste took a step back. "Don't make a scene," she hissed under her breath. I stepped closer. "No," I said loud and clear. "You already made the scene. I'm just giving it the right lighting." Security arrived within minutes. Celeste was escorted out. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked back at me like a woman who had no more cards to play. And I felt taller than I had in years. Later that evening, I received a phone call. It was Raymond. He didn't waste time. "She told me everything," he said. "She's threatening to go public. Says I was part of it." "And were you?" I asked. Silence. "Marlene," he said. "I made mistakes, but I didn't know she was doing all that." "You handed her the pen," I said. "You just didn't read what she wrote." "I didn't mean for it to go this far. But you were willing to benefit from it," I said. "You wanted to bury me and move into your next chapter." "That's not true," he said. "I was scared." "So was I replied. "But I didn't sell you out to survive." He sighed. "What do you want from me?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "Nothing," I said. "That's what you're worth now." Then I hung up. The next morning, I met Ellis at the county clerk's office. We filed a full revision of my will. Everything went into a trust. Carefully structured. Bulletproof. I added 2 names to it. My goddaughter, Rosie, and my old neighbor Lorraine, who used to help with groceries when I could barely walk. I left Raymond exactly $1. Not because he needed it, but because I wanted the court to know he was left out on purpose. A week later, I saw Celeste again. This time, she was leaving the bank in a rush, papers flapping in her hand. She didn't see me, but I watched her from my car as she argued with a teller and stormed off down the sidewalk. She looked smaller now. Not thinner, just smaller. Like a person who finally realized they'd built their castle on someone else's grave, and the ground was sinking. I didn't feel joy. Not quite. But I felt something better. Closure. It took me 3 weeks to write it. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I had too much to say, and none of it fit neatly on the page. I sat at the dining table where Raymond and I had eaten over 2,000 meals together. I opened my favorite pen, and I started the letter. Not to Raymond. Not to Celeste. To myself. To the woman I had been a year ago. The woman who sat in that cold clinic room with needles in her veins, thinking she was alone. The woman who came home to silence, to tension, to a man who was slowly turning their marriage into an exit plan. The woman who nearly died believing love was supposed to look like routine and guilt and sacrifice. This letter was for her. I wrote, "You are not stupid. You are not weak. You are not dying. You are becoming." I folded it, placed it in an envelope, and put it in my nightstand. Not to be sent, just to be kept. Then I called Rosie, my goddaughter. "Come by tomorrow," I said. "I need help painting something." She showed up the next afternoon, all smiles and paint rollers. "What are we painting?" she asked. "The front door." She blinked. "Why?" "Because I want it to look new when people walk in. I want it to say, 'Someone lives here now.'" We painted it a soft teal. Something bright. Something warm. While it dried, we sat on the porch and drank sweet tea. Rosie looked over at me and said, "I'm glad you're still here." I smiled. "Me too." A few days later, I got a call from Ellis. "The fraud report you filed," he said. "It triggered an investigation. On Celeste. On both of them." Turns out, Raymond had done more than just transfer money. He'd lied on official documents. Forged signatures. Violated trust agreements. Celeste had been complicit, but Raymond had made it possible. "There's a chance he'll be charged," Ellis said. "Will it go to court?" "Maybe. If not, it'll be settled quietly." I nodded, staring out at the sunlit street. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I know," he replied. "You want truth." "Yes. And dignity." The following Sunday, I went to church for the first time since the diagnosis. I wore a simple dress. No scarf. My soft fuzz of hair uncovered. I walked in alone. People gasped when they saw me. "Marlene," they whispered. "You look well. You're glowing. How are you here?" I smiled and took my usual pew. Alone. But not lonely. Not anymore. The pastor's sermon was on restoration. He talked about how some things don't need to be rebuilt, just remembered. And as I sat there, hands folded in my lap, I realized I had made it to the other side. Not just of the betrayal, but of the belief that my value was tied to someone else's love. I had become my own proof of survival. And that was enough. Later that week, I walked past the marina where Raymond had once promised to take me sailing. We never did. Guess he took Celeste instead. I sat on a bench nearby and watched the waves. That's when a young woman sat next to me. She had tears in her eyes. "Rough day?" I asked. She nodded. "My mom just passed. And I don't know how to be strong for my dad." I nodded. "You don't have to be strong," I said. "You just have to be honest." She blinked at me. "Were you a nurse?" "No," I said, smiling. "Just someone who's lived through things." She thanked me, got up, walked away lighter than when she sat down. And I realized that's what I had become. Not bitter. Not broken. Just useful again. It was early April when the notice arrived. A formal subpoena, stamped and sealed, addressed to both Raymond and Celeste. The state had opened an official investigation after my fraud report. What began as a quiet correction of signatures and frozen accounts had now become something bigger, criminal. The charge: conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable adult. When Ellis handed me the envelope, I sat very still. "You're not required to testify," he said, "but you're entitled to attend." "Will it be public?" I asked. "Very." I nodded and folded the paper into my purse. "Then I'll be there. In the front row." The day of the hearing, I wore a navy blue dress and a pearl brooch my mother had left me. I tied a light scarf over my head, not to hide my thinning hair, but to honor the journey I had survived. When I walked into the courthouse, people moved aside. Not because they recognized me, but because I carried myself like someone who'd come for the truth. Raymond sat across the aisle. His hair was grayer, shoulders hunched. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who had aged 20 years in the last two. Celeste sat beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The lipstick was gone. The glamour wilted. When the judge asked them to rise, I didn't look away. The courtroom heard about the forged power of attorney, the unauthorized transfers, the real estate attempts, the life insurance beneficiary fraud. But what moved the room wasn't paperwork. It was my statement. I stood slowly, hands steady. "My name is Marlene Trask," I said, voice clear. "I am 73 years old. I was diagnosed with cancer and underwent 3 rounds of chemotherapy. During that time, my husband and his mistress quietly tried to erase me. Not with poison, but with paperwork." Gasps rippled through the benches. They plotted to take what wasn't theirs, while I was fighting to keep my breath. They stood in my kitchen, used my towels, drank my coffee, and planned my funeral as if it were already done. I paused. And yet I lived. The room fell silent. The judge thanked me. I nodded once and returned to my seat. Raymond never looked up. They were both found guilty. The sentence wasn't prison, though part of me wished it had been. It was restitution, financial penalties, and permanent loss of legal access to my estate. Celeste was banned from working in fiduciary or medical roles ever again. But the victory wasn't in the verdict. It was in the silence that followed. No more calls. No more whispers. No more control. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "I was wrong. I thought you'd be easy to erase. But you were the fire, and I was the ash." There was no name, but I knew the handwriting. I folded the paper, placed it in the back of my journal, and never replied. Some apologies aren't for accepting. They're just for keeping. In the weeks that followed, neighbors dropped off food. Rosie visited more often. I joined a small book club at the community center, and even started teaching a writing class on Tuesdays. I had become what no one expected. Happy. Not because I got revenge, but because I reclaimed what they tried to take. Not just my money, not just my home, but my name, my dignity, my peace. And soon, something else would arrive at my door. Something that would remind me that life doesn't stop after heartbreak. Sometimes, it begins. It was a Sunday morning. The house was quiet, sun streaming through the front windows, and I had just sat down with a warm cup of tea and a small cinnamon muffin when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. No appointments. No deliveries. And certainly no drama. I opened the door slowly. There stood a woman, maybe in her late 30s. Brown curls pulled back in a loose clip. Simple dress. Nervous eyes. She held a stack of papers in her hand, and a hesitant smile on her face. "Are you Mrs. Marlene Trask?" she asked. "I am." She shifted slightly. "My name is Annalise Maddox." The last name hit me first. Maddox. Celeste's. She must have seen the flicker in my face, because she rushed to add, I'm not here because of her. I haven't spoken to my mother in over 5 years. I stood still, unsure. May I come in? She asked softly. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once signed a wedding license, balanced a checkbook, and discovered betrayal. Now, I was making tea for a stranger whose face trembled like it might break. She slid the stack of papers toward me. Celeste told me once, years ago, that she and your husband were planning something. She didn't tell me the full story, but I could see it wasn't just an affair. She paused. When the court notices started hitting her mailbox, she panicked. I found some documents she had hidden in a folder marked as taxes. But they weren't taxes. They were bank transfers, asset plans, a copy of your original trust, notes in her handwriting, and a letter. She looked at me. I think it was meant to blackmail him. I blinked. She continued. I don't want anything. I just didn't want to be like her. And I thought you should have everything she tried to keep. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were things even Ellis hadn't found. Drafts of fake wills. Life insurance inquiries. A handwritten list titled, What We'll Do With It All. My name was scribbled next to a $sign. You were supposed to be a bump in the road, Annalise said. A temporary obstacle. I closed the folder. But you didn't die, she said. You lived. And now they have nothing. I looked at her closely. She wasn't like Celeste. She was softer. Honest. Tired. Do you have a place to stay? I asked. She blinked. I'm fine, really. I nodded. But I wrapped the leftover muffins in a paper towel and handed them to her anyway. She smiled. And before she left, she turned and asked, Can I hug you? I hadn't been hugged in a long time. I stood, slowly, and let her wrap her arms around me. It was warm. Real. Human. When the door closed behind her, I looked around the house again. And for the first time in years, it felt full. The next month, I signed the final documents that made my new trust irrevocable. Ellis called me a legend. I told him I preferred survivor. At my final oncology appointment, the doctor said the scans were clear. You're in remission. I smiled. I already knew. Because peace feels different in the body. It settles behind the ribs like sunlight. 1 year later, I hosted Thanksgiving. Rosie brought sweet potatoes. Lorraine made cornbread. Annalise returned with a tray of deviled eggs and her new baby daughter in a sling across her chest. The house was alive. Laughter echoed off the walls. No shadows. No secrets. Just food, love, and the kind of warmth money can't buy. After everyone left, I stood in the quiet kitchen, hands still sticky with cranberry sauce, and looked at the front door. The teal paint had faded a little, but the message remained. Someone lives here. A woman who wasn't erased. A woman who fought for her name. A woman who turned betrayal into beginning. And in that quiet, I finally whispered it out loud. I'm proud of you. Not to anyone else. Just to the woman who needed to hear it. Me. It happened quietly. No applause. No grand speech. Just the sound of a pen scratching across paper as I signed my name onto the final deed. My name. Alone. Marlene Elaine Trask. And below it, no cosigner. No secondary access. No legal loopholes. Just me. The house was now mine in full again, not just emotionally, but legally, permanently, without contest. I sat in Ellis's office, sunlight pouring through the windows, warming the side of my face. I looked down at the notary's stamp and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. Not from harm. From history. Safe from the quiet kind of betrayal, the kind that creeps in with good intentions and leaves you empty while pretending to love you. Ellis looked at me over his glasses. You did what most people couldn't, he said. I didn't know I could, I told him. Not until I had to. He nodded, then closed the folder and stood to shake my hand. I walked out of the office and down the steps into the Florida heat. It smelled like salt and pavement and coming rain. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove to the old marina. The one where Raymond had taken Celeste on the weekends. The one he never thought I'd find. I parked, walked out to the edge of the dock, and dropped something into the water. It was his watch. The one I bought him for our 25th anniversary. I held on to it too long, thinking it still meant something. But all it ever did was remind me of time I couldn't get back. Now it was gone. And I felt lighter. At home, I opened the box of letters I had kept since treatment. Messages from friends, neighbors, old church ladies, and even strangers who had heard my story once it made the rounds in town. One read, "You gave me hope. I'm 72 and going through something similar. I thought I was alone." Another said, "I showed your story to my daughter. She said, 'Grandma, you're just like this woman.'" And a third, from someone I'd never met, ended with, "Thank you for reminding me it's never too late to be your own hero." I pressed my palm against my chest. Let those words settle into my bones. Because that's what I had become. My own hero. Not in the dramatic, Hollywood sense. But in the way I chose to stay. To heal. To not become bitter. To open the windows and let the light back in. On my 74th birthday, Rosie threw a surprise lunch at my house. There were balloons. A lemon cake. Laughing neighbors, including Annalise with her baby in a pink onesie, cooing and chewing on her tiny fist. Someone toasted me near the end of the meal. To Marlene, they said, who reminded us that storms don't mean the end. Sometimes they clear the air so you can finally see. I raised my glass, smiled, and simply said, "To new beginnings." That night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were done, I stood in the doorway of the house and looked out at the street. The porch light glowed warm. The breeze smelled like hibiscus. And I realized, the house wasn't the prize. The money wasn't the revenge. The true victory was this. I survived. I uncovered the betrayal. I held them accountable. And I came out with more than I started with, because I found myself again. Not the wife. Not the patient. Not the widow in waiting. But the woman who fought in silence. And won in peace. If this story moved you, take a moment. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Marlene's shoes? And where are you watching from? Don't forget to like the video to support more true stories like this one. Subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of survival, truth, and quiet strength. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded. It's never too late to take your power back.